Welcome to the You Can Learn Photography podcast, where we introduce photographers from Canada, not just the well-known, but the everyday hobbyist through to the professional who have a passion for photography and want to share their knowledge. We're going to get to know who they are, what they care about. We'll take a look at some of their work, find out what they're currently doing, and what they wish they would have known in the beginning. All right, let's jump into it. Welcome to episode 20 of the You Can Learn Photography podcast with your host, Trevor A. Walt. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dave Brosha, a professional creative photographic artist and author currently based in Prince Edward Island, Canada. We'll get to know Dave as we talk about how his relocation to Nunavut, a small community in the Canadian Arctic, with his first digital camera, writing about his images on a personal blog during the infancy of the internet, launched his photography career. We'll discuss how his life experiences influence his confidence with the importance of believing in yourself through life acquaintances, encouragement, and various encounters while working on personal projects and assignments that led to many opportunities. We'll talk about the influences of social media and the importance to photograph for yourself and what you enjoy to establish your own identity. Then we'll look at the deeper importance of photography from a historical perspective, whether it's people, landscapes, or events. Plus, his influences and photography as a business, including work-life balance. So come join us on this information-packed episode while on your walk, drive, or just sit back in your comfy chair while listening to our conversation with Dave. So Dave, we briefly met at your Moments of Magic Art in the Landscape Workshop held by the Sackville Photo Club in Halifax in April of 2019 after you released your first book, Northern Light. My wife, Darlene, has since attended a number of your online as well as in-person workshop, and we discussed the possibility of you being a guest on the podcast at your character workshop in October 2023 at Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Subsequently, we're so glad you are able to be here with us today. Through our discussion, we'll be getting to know you better, discuss how your adventures around the globe led to your many life experiences, connecting you to making a living through photography. We'll look at some of your work, discuss some of your most memorable projects, what you've been recently up to, and discuss how you find a work-life balance making a living as a professional photographer, juggling numerous projects and workshops. You are a multi-genre, multi-award-winning photographer, mentor, speaker, workshop leader throughout Canada and the globe, author of 4 books, Northern Light, Southern Light, Tones of Grace, and The Art of Misadventure, a Sigma Pro photographer, a Strobe Pro professional, and a Canadian Geographic ambassador. Also, from a portrait perspective, you have photographed celebrities, royalty, Juno award-winning artists, veterans, wedding, and the list just goes on and on. You've been published by CNN, Photolife magazine, Canadian Geographic, and the Daily Telegraph, to name a few, have been interviewed by many news organizations, including the CBC, about how to shoot images of the night sky, with a number of videos on YouTube about your work as well. You have an online presence through your website and social media, but for the folks out there who don't know you yet that will be listening to this podcast, Dave, who are you?
First of all, hi, Trevor. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm very honored to be on your podcast. But yeah, who am I? I guess just I'm a person who I'm in my mid-40s. I still feel like I'm 15 years old, and I just like exploring the world. And I'm just fortunate enough to be able to have a camera in hand doing that. And it's really just this tool that gets me out there enjoying life.
One of your first books that you wrote after your Northern Light book really is stories about what you called misadventures. If people want to get to know you, I mean, that would be a great place to start. You talk about many of your adventures and encounters and how that really relates to how you became a photographer, I guess. It seems that you've traveled quite a bit through life requirements to get employment in various different forms of employment. So when you first started, I guess really basically, and people got to know you from your northern adventures, how did you start picking up the camera and getting involved in being a photographer?
It wasn't really a planned thing. I had no clue as a young man or in high school or university or anything like that I was going to eventually become a photographer. I guess I was born with a curiosity, and I knew I had a bit of an artistic side, but I never really knew what that would translate into. I ended up going to school, post-secondary, and just kind of bouncing around trying to figure it all out and see what life was going to bring. I ended up bouncing between like a business program and an arts program, and seeing if I would like accounting and seeing if I liked, just different things. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And
Right.
I ended up the end of university with a degree in English literature, kind of with this vague notion that I wanted to become a teacher.
Right.
More, I guess romantically, I wanted to become a writer. But I realized very quickly as I kind of sent off different pieces of writing to publications and getting rejection notice after rejection notice that just declaring yourself a writer wasn't really an easy way to make a career. And so I kind of gave up on that dream. And I just, after university, did it kind of a whole hodgepodge of different things. I ended up working for a pipeline installation company. I ended up owning a hot dog stand. And eventually ended up moving to Nunavut just in search of employment and just kind of life experience. And so I moved to Nunavut, I want to say when I was around 24 or 25 years old, up into the Canadian Arctic. And it was just kind of a whim. Right before I left for Nunavut, I remember going to Staples or one of those kind of stores, and I had heard lots about digital cameras, which were in their infancy at the time. Right. This was the year 2002. And I just knew I was going to this incredible, unique, beautiful place. I'd only ever seen pictures of it, but a place where the Arctic Ocean and tundra and icebergs and polar bears and all that kind of stuff. And really just thought that I would bring this little digital camera with me to snap a couple pictures to share with people back home. And so I ended up buying that camera, which was a Fujifilm 2-megapixel camera. Okay. And going up there and starting work and starting employment and just, again, no notions of becoming a photographer, but just started making snapshots.
Right.
And back then there wasn't Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any platform to really share photographs. And so I remember I just had this little email newsletter just with friends and family on it, where once every month or two I would send a little email out saying, hey, here's what I'm seeing in the Arctic, and with a couple pictures attached. And eventually I started a little personal blog website. I knew a little bit of HTML. And long story short, so just that process of snapping memories and sharing them with folks back home, it kind of piqued my interest in photography. I realized that I actually loved being out there, and I loved that process of trying to find an interesting, I guess, observation of the world and sharing it with other people and trying to impact in different ways. And so it didn't take long. I think maybe I was up there 6 months or 7 months when I started getting more and more of an interest in photography, and just it kind of evolved from there. Just ended up trying to learn as much as I could about it, which at that time wasn't easy because you didn't have YouTube. And well, maybe YouTube was in its infancy, but I remember just ordering photography books from Amazon, stuff like that, to try to piece together how you do it.
Right. So in Nunavut, you're saying around 2002?
Yes.
So the internet then, well, somewhat at its infancy, really 1996 is about when it kind of started. You're up north, connectivity to the rest of the world isn't really all that great in 2002.
As bad as it was in places down south here in Canada, simpatico dial-up internet and stuff like that, up there, it was even that much worse. I remember 3 or 4 different apartments basically sharing the equivalent of one dial-up connection. So to try to load anything at all was near impossible.
Right. So you started a blog. So now you've got a Bachelor of Arts degree, sort of a little more on the English literature side. You want to be a writer. You start a blog. Now you put your pictures up and you write about the pictures and your experiences.
Yeah. And so that's exactly it. Whenever I had the energy, about once every couple weeks, I would just do a little paragraph with a picture, put it on this web page. But it's interesting because that little personal website kind of actually led to the whole idea of becoming a photographer too, because I never had these grand notions that I was any good. I just took pictures and put them on the blog more to share the information.
Right.
But I think it was about 6 months or so after I started this personal website, I had an inquiry one day from a magazine looking to publish one of the photographs that I had put on this blog. And I remember just thinking to myself, oh, how crazy is that? I've been trying to be a writer. I've been submitting to magazines and literature reviews and stuff like that and getting rejection notice after rejection notice. And here I am, a very famous kind of American magazine, Scientific American, reaches out to want to publish one of my photographs when I didn't consider myself any good at photography. And just a little interesting sidebar on that. So I was really excited. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be a published photographer. And without even knowing how, I was still shooting in auto mode.
Right.
So I send the picture to Scientific American and they write me back and say, okay, that's fine. We like your image, but can you send us the real image, the high resolution file? And I had no idea what they meant. And I was just like, the file is what it is. And it was this 2 megapixel image that I downsized and I think saved over the original because I didn't know better in those days. And so I think it was like a 7 kilobyte image that I sent them. I don't know if it was quite that small, but they wrote back and just kind of laughed and were like, we can't publish this. And I just remember being so disappointed, but it sparked an interest, right? It was just like, oh my gosh, maybe there's something to this photography business, right? Maybe I should pursue that more.
And so you mentioned you started seeking out some learning photography information. So you're like a self-taught photographer?
Yeah, I qualify that statement though. I'm self-taught, but I mean, I have learned from countless photographers and heroes and inspirations over the years and just picked up little bits from many different people. But probably the very first strong influence that I had from kind of that Amazon chapters journey living in the Arctic was, I remember the very first photography book I ever ordered was The Inner Game of Outdoor Photography by the American photographer Galen Rowell.
Okay.
He's a fantastic photographer. And this book is very deep and introspective. And it wasn't simply this is how you understand exposure kind of book. It talked about just the whole reason why we photograph and why it's important to capture the world around us. And I just remember it having a very strong impact on me. I still love that to this day.
In your misadventures, you talk about a photographer that you met, actually a very well-known photographer that actually wrote a foreword to one of your photo books, Northern Light. And he must have had a significant influence. And also seeing him and watching him take photographs, it probably had an influence on your trajectory in photography as well.
Yeah, it's funny because there's so many different just little things that happen in your life that if you look at it, they connected a dot in some way and led to. And so the photographer you're referring to, of course, is Martin Hartley, who was an incredible British photographer. And if I look back upon that time when I got into photography, it was I couldn't have been more fortunate because I just kind of gotten this itch to learn. I'd ordered and read that book from Galen Rowell, and then I think it was just a couple months later, so as I'm kind of just out there practicing a little bit more and more, so I was living in Resolute Bay, Nunavut, which is kind of the launching pad for, at least in those days, for a lot of the polar explorers. So people would come from all around the world to Resolute Bay every spring. And they would use it as training grounds, but also kind of where they would fly out of to eventually kind of go try to reach the North Pole. And so there'd be all these adventurers who would take fully loaded sleds and skis, and they'd go out on the Arctic Ocean and make these attempts to go to the North Pole. So when I was there, and I think it was the spring of 2003, I worked part-time for this polar logistics company.
Right.
And they were supporting a British adventurer named Penn Haddow, who was trying to become the first British person to trek or walk solo and unsupported to the North Pole. And it was kind of a big deal. I guess these adventurers take their goals and their records pretty seriously. So he had kind of launched this journey, and it takes many weeks. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was something like a 5 or 6 week journey. Anyways, towards the end of that, it looked like he was actually going to make that happen. He was going to be successful. So he had a team come over, which included a photographer who was going to be doing a piece for one of the UK's big newspapers. It's this photographer, Martin Hartley. And he comes over, and we're doing logistics for this expedition. And Martin knows that I have this very amateur, passive interest in photography. To his credit, to this day, he looked at me and he's like, well, Dave, I'm heading out on the ocean tomorrow or the Arctic Ocean on snowmobile to go take some photographs of the environment, whatever, before I fly up in a small twin otter plane to kind of where Penn is about to make this hopefully successful North Pole accomplishment happen. And long story short, he invited me out on the ice with him to just spend the day. And so this guy had been published in National Geographic, and he would eventually become Time Magazine's environmental hero, I think in 2010, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
A while ago. And anyway, so I went out and spent this incredible day and a half really with Martin on the ice, and he has a true professional. He's been around the world photographing, and he's got this Mamiya 645 film camera that he's got pieces of styrofoam taped all around it to keep the blowing Arctic snow out of his camera. Right. And he just rugged, and he looked like my version of a hero. Right. Right. I looked at him, and I looked at what I was doing in my life and everything. And I was like, you have the coolest job ever. And how incredible if I could ever take a picture even 10% as good as you. But he had no judgment. He just looked at me and encouraged me, and he knew I was shooting with this little dinky digital camera, but he didn't judge that. He knew that I couldn't even shoot off auto mode at that time. I still wasn't even shooting manual or anything like that. He just encouraged me. And I remember later that evening when we kind of got back to my apartment, he took the time out to kind of look through some of my portfolio and pictures and just critique me, and he was very nicely, brutally honest. I remember him flipping through some of the pictures and saying, like, that one's crap. That one's crap. Right. Oh, this one's pretty decent. You have maybe you're onto something with that one. And anyways, he was just fantastic. And he remains to this day a huge inspiration.
Right. Young and influenced by what he was doing and who he became. And you're thinking to yourself, I can do this, right?
That passed my mind, that thought, but I didn't really have the self-confidence in those days to even believe that I could. Right. And it was actually Martin again. I remember 2 or 3 years later, I had moved to Yellowknife, and by chance he was passing through Yellowknife to go up to the Arctic again. And so we arranged to meet up at the airport. And I remember him 3 years after that first meeting, taking a look at just where I was and basically kicking me in the butt and saying, like, Dave, you can do this. Like, you got to believe in yourself and make things happen. And I think it was those words of encouragement that kind of gave me maybe the belief that I could. Right.
Every one of these little experiences putting together your life history.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. You don't think of it at the time. You're just like, oh, this is a cool thing. It's just an adventure. It's an experience. But they do collectively add up to your life history. Right?
And if you have the ability to listen and pay attention and not talking, right? You're actually listening and absorbing. All of these opportunities become something in the end.
I love that you said that, because I think so many people make the mistake in life of just always talking and never just sitting back and like you say, listening and observing. And I think that's where a lot of the wisdom of the world comes to you through, right?
All these guys have experienced things. It's like you teach, and when you teach your class, you try to instill a lot of information in a very condensed period of time, knowing that it's taken you a long time to achieve what you're trying to teach and show somebody in a short period of time. And the advantage of listening for the person who's on your course can take advantage of that, and they can ramp up so much quicker now by investing in that type of knowledge.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. And I mean, of course, I'm a bit biased. I do run courses and workshops and all that, and it's always wonderful when people sign up. But I'm a big believer in education, and I'm a big believer in listening to other voices of people who've walked the road before you. And I love listening to other, not just photographers, but artists, human beings in general who've walked a path. I love listening and trying to learn something from their experiences.
Right. So do you have other interests and hobbies that complement your photography or relate to it? Or do you have some hobbies and interests that kind of take you away from the photography to give you a little bit of some relaxation so you can be reinvigorated to get back at your photography?
I'm a person who, as I mentioned, I just love learning, right? So I have very diverse interests, and I'm not one to sit around and not do much.
Right.
I kind of get twitchy, and I need to kind of be learning and just, I don't know, I just find it all fascinating. So I love reading. I love, right now I'm learning both guitar and piano.
Oh, cool.
That's kind of my relaxation mode. I love just sitting down and strumming a guitar for 10 or 15 minutes, or sitting down to the piano for 10 minutes. I love cooking. I love just hiking. And very often I go outside without my camera just to kind of force myself to make sure that I'm slowing down and really just, practicing what I preach too. Like, I really believe, I love the power of observation through photography, but I love just taking in the world too. I think it's a fascinating place. So yeah, no, I really do have a bunch of different hobbies and things that I enjoy doing. And that includes photography. I do it for a living. And sometimes, yes, of course, it's work. But there are oftentimes I just go out and get lost behind just trying to capture some little detail of the world that I know will never be a professional photograph that anyone cares about, but it's just, I find it fascinating myself, right?
Right. Something for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So being a professional photographer now, trying to find that work-life balance, because, looking at your website and all the list of the workshops that you've got coming up this year, it's going to be quite a hectic, busy schedule. How do you find that for you, the work-life balance?
It's interesting because I have a lot of people that look at, or they might just follow me on social media and say, well, you were just there and now you're here. And it must be so crazy busy all the time. It's a little bit deceiving. I mean, just in the fact that social media can make you look busy, and yes, you might have a trip somewhere and do work around that or be teaching a workshop, but that's still a fairly small fraction of your overall life. And, but it's always a challenge. And there are times when I'm really busy and times when I'm really slow. I mean, this last year, for example, was a really busy year for me, just because we went through the whole COVID travel restrictions for a couple of years, and a big bulk of my life and my business involves travel. So a lot of that got put on hold, and trips that I was to be leading got put on hold. And so all of a sudden last year, when things really opened back up again, I had a backlog of things to get through, people that were waiting to go on different trips. So last year was a very busy year. But right now, for example, I'm kind of in a nice 4 or 5 month stint without much travel at all and just really enjoying working around my house and property and being able to play piano and spend lots of great time with my kitties. And yeah, so I think one of the things that I try to do each and every year is really look at my whole business and life and creative life and just try to eliminate the stuff that doesn't bring you joy or that you find is too much work and just time commitment without the reward, so that I can shift my time more and more to spending time with loved ones and having time for hobbies and all that.
Right.
So yeah, I really do believe in that work-life balance. And I have an unusual life and structure, right? Like there's times when I'm on the road for say 3 or 4 weeks and it's just busy, teach. And I love that. But then I have the opportunity and luxury of being able to come home and perhaps not have to work for 2 or 3 weeks and go to an office and do the 9 to 5. And it's an untraditional structure compared to a lot of people's lives. But I still feel like my overall time balance that I have at home, that I have to just experience downtime, is actually quite high, which I love.
Yeah. You talk about the social media perception. Same thing would be for a musical artist. All we see as a person consuming their content is we see them releasing a new album or releasing a new single or performing on a stage. They don't understand, we as a consumer of their creations don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. In your case, we don't understand that it takes 10 to 15 hours to produce an hour's worth of content for one of your courses, and all the prep work preparing for a workshop, making sure that all the locations are lined up. If you have require models, for example, that stuff's all lined up, and so on and so forth. And it takes hours and hours and hours of commitment, but yet, when you post a few images on social media saying, oh, we had this workshop, and show a few images, it really doesn't sort of describe or explain the whole thing of what went on to actually get there.
You nailed it, Trevor. Like it's an incredible amount of work. It really is. It might seem glamorous to somebody on the outside to be like, oh, you got to go to Scotland or you got to go to Mongolia. But yeah, there are literally hundreds of hours of logistics that go into that kind of thing. And when you're on those experiences, you're in charge and responsible for all the people that are with you. So your mind is going 24/7, thinking logistics, thinking safety, thinking of the next stop you got to go to. And what if this doesn't work out? What are you going to go to next? And so it is an incredible amount of work. And listen, I'm not complaining about that for a second. Like I realize that I'm very fortunate to be able to do what I do, and it's something I choose. But I've always kind of disliked the term luck. Right. Like I think there's a degree of luck in life, but I hear often from people like you're so lucky to get to do what you get to do. And I really feel like any human being, the work you put in to anything translates to an outcome. Right. And yes, of course, there's different degrees of privilege and opportunity within that. I'm very fortunate to be born in Canada and to have loving parents and all that kind of stuff. But a lot, I think, of your life comes down to what you put into it. And I think, whether it's a workshop or a wedding or just building a website or learning a skill, it takes a lot of work. It takes an incredible amount of work. And that is the behind the scenes stuff. Going back to your music artist example, right? You don't have a Jimmy Page or a Prince or one of these incredible musicians becoming who they are without those hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of hours of behind the scenes practice and refinement and just trying their best and putting themselves out there with rejection a million times before an opportunity actually happens. I think that's a big part of success too. Yeah, it is a lot of work, but it's work that I think if you find that thing in this world that you love, it's work that you love doing.
Right.
Right.
If you enjoy what you do, you never work a day of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, yeah. Now, I'll qualify that. Email is always terrible. I don't think anyone loves doing email. It goes with the territory, and there's always those tasks that you have to do that you don't love. But
Right.
I very much agree with that statement, though. I think, I don't know if you've ever heard of Alan Watts.
No.
I think I have his name right. He was an American educator, and there's this incredible little just clip on YouTube that you can find, and it's all about just what would you do with your life, or what should you do with your life. And he talks in this clip about that we generally as human beings live a life of madness because we live to work, and we work for this supposed holy grail at the end of the work cycle. And his argument is that if you know that you only have this one life to live and you're going to die anyways, find that thing that you love and just spend more time doing that. Find the time, find like the energy for it, because that could lead to many beautiful things in your life.
Yeah. Need to put it in perspective from the point of view of you don't really want to live to work. You want to work to live, and understand that time is the gift.
Oh, it's the greatest currency that we have, right? It really, truly is.
Yeah. And we talk about people thinking that you're lucky. If you put the work in, it puts you in the position to be lucky.
It can. It absolutely can, right? Like,
Yeah.
and not that putting tons of work in is an automatic qualifier or like automatically lead to some grand success. It doesn't always. I mean,
Right. Not everybody's successful.
if you're doing something you love, you'll never waste those hours.
Right. Exactly. So when we talk about how your photography started, does photography have a deeper meaning for you now? And how much did it impact your life overall?
Oh, absolutely. It has a deeper meaning now. I think when I first started photography, and there's probably a lot of photographers out there who can put up their hand or be guilty of this. I think when I first started photography, I didn't look to any deep meaning. It was more just like, hey, this is pretty cool, right? Or like, I like creating a cool image. I like getting a reaction from somebody. And I think over time, though, one thing that I've come to the realization is that what you capture as a photographer over time in a body of work, it's actually meaningful. It's important. And not saying that it will change the world or anything like that, but it's recording a history and a time and place of whatever the subject is that you're capturing.
Right.
If you love photographing people, you might just think to yourself at the start, like, I'm creating a cool picture of somebody that might get a few likes on Instagram.
Right.
But bottom line, you're capturing that person in a time and place, and they're not going to live forever. They're going to change. And to somebody, someday, that picture is going to be meaningful. Right. And I've seen that happen again and again in my career, where a picture that I just photographed as a cool creative project ends up impacting somebody. And it's an incredible thing to know that that happens, even if you know that that's not your intent starting out. From a nature and landscape perspective, I think I vastly underestimated, maybe in my earlier career, just how important some of these like images that we all take can serve as historical record to a place. I'm sure we've all seen those examples of like a photograph taken in 1930 that shows a glacier, for example.
Right.
And then you compare it to 2020, the same area, and see that glacier has receded a kilometer, and just the landscape is completely transformed. And so we might not even realize when we're taking photographs of places, whether it be an urban landscape or like out in nature, that our images that we take today might be looked by somebody in the future as being a very important historical record of a time and place.
Exactly.
So there's just so many deeper meanings to, I think, this craft of photography that we don't even understand at the time that we're doing it. We're just trying to have a hobby or do something fun, right? Or try to be a little bit artistic. But
Right.
yeah.
We've touched on a few people's names, that artists and so on that you've met, and other artists that you've looked at some of their work. But are there specific people and artists that are influencing your work now or have dramatically influenced your work over the last few years?
Yeah, I'm like a a shapeshifter maybe when it comes to my influences. I feel like every week, every month, I'm stumbling upon somebody new and being inspired by them in different ways and shapes and forms. I mean, I'm a multi-genre photographer. I love portraiture. I love wildlife. I love landscape. I love street photography. And I mentioned before Martin Hartley and Galen Rowell being some of my earliest influences in photography. But in the portrait world, for example, I mean, I'm been strongly influenced by Annie Leibovitz, Joe McNally, Joel Grimes, Lee Jeffries. I travel often and teach alongside my good friend Wayne Simpson. And I mean, his portraiture is constantly inspiring me. In the landscape and nature realm these days, I think I'm more inspired by storytellers and just people that go out and create bodies of work around a theme. It inspires me maybe more so than Instagram superstars who get 1 million likes on a photograph. Like I love the idea of creating these bodies of work. And I mean, a great Canadian example, he's somebody whose work I've admired for a long time, but Mark Kogel out of British Columbia, he does these minimalistic black and white interpretations of the world. On the surface, so simple. You look at them and they're like, these are just so minimalistic and simple, but it takes a high degree of artistic proficiency to be able to do what he does. And I'm always so blown away by his work. I also love, just in the wildlife realm, which has been one of my biggest passions in the last few years, especially wildlife photography. I'm constantly inspired by people like John Marriott and Brittany Crossman and a French photographer by the name of Vincent Mounier. And I'm brutalizing the pronunciation. He's got a much more French pronunciation of his name, but just, yeah, these are all photographers I deeply admire, and because they have just picked their thing in life and their passion, and they showcase their worlds in such incredible ways. So long story short, Trevor, I'm very open to inspiration, and I'm constantly looking around me to just things that surprise me. I think that's one of the biggest things that might get a bit difficult as you get further and further and further into a craft. So I'm now 22, 23 years, whatever it is, into photography. So you have seen a lot in that time.
Right.
And you don't want to become the old jaded person, but you see a lot of images over time and a lot of repetition, right, and a lot of just, it takes more and more to surprise you, I guess.
Right.
And so when you do see an image that makes you pause, or you do see a body of work that makes you pause, it's a really exciting thing. And it really, I love diving into those little collections and portfolios and artists when I happen upon them now, because they're doing something special if they catch your eye,
right,
after you've got 20 years in the game, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what do you find now the most difficult part about being a professional photographer?
I would say, well, you're ultimately a freelancer. You're a freelancer in life, and just, I mean, in a perfect world, and I'm sure a lot of professional photographers or artists would say this, is, I mean, it'd be great if somebody could just write you a big check to cover your life so that you can just go do your art, because being out there photographing and creating is the thing that drives all of us, I think. And so having to make a living at it, there's always that balance, and it's always you wonder where the next paycheck's going to come from. And have you thought ahead to, okay, do I have enough money to cover my bills 4 months from now? And so you have to be a business person alongside the artist. And that's a pendulum, right? Like you just wish that you can always have it swing into going out and just creating for yourself 24/7, because that's where the greatest joy is. But you also have to pay your bills. Yeah. So I would say, for the last 20 years, that's been my biggest, or the most difficult part about being a professional, is just making sure that you can make a living at it so that you can pursue the aspects of it that you love the most. Right. And I mean, I've been fortunate enough that the business has gone all right for the last 20 years and I'm able to still do this, but I never take that for granted. And every single year you almost ask yourself, like, okay, is this the year I got to go get a real job? Unfortunately, I haven't had to get a real job yet.
Right.
And I joke about that. This is a lot of work, but it's always a balance.
Yeah, it's not just a 9 to 5 job.
Oh, no, it's not. And anyone who photographs a wedding or something like that knows that. Just you're putting in dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. I can't count how many times I've been up to midnight editing a batch of pictures to do the next day. Like, yeah, it's definitely not a 9 to 5 world, but it's a great world.
Exactly. So talking about photography and being a professional and making it a career, looking after the finances, there's projects that we need to do to generate income and so on. So what are some of your most memorable photos or memorable projects that you've done over your career so far?
Well, I've been super fortunate in the sense that I've had like a lot of different experiences and a lot of great clients and a lot of great just opportunities that have allowed me to kind of balance the whole making an income. But in terms of some of my favorite photos and some of my favorite projects, now some of them have come out of paid projects. Some of them are just things that I do that may perhaps lead to some sort of life revenue in some aspect. For example, one thing, I mean, it was one of my earliest projects. I'll call it a project, but it was for a client, even though he didn't pay me barely anything. Way back in, I think it was 2010, I had the opportunity to go to Egypt for about a month over 2 different trips, 2 weeks per trip, to photograph an Australian adventurer who believed in my photography. And he was on some big project to kayak down the length of the Nile and then cross the Sahara Desert to set some sort of record. And so he had me come photograph basically a month of that journey. I think it took him 6 or 7 months in total. And so, yeah, to be a young photographer, to go spend a month in Egypt in off the beaten tourist track and really just go document and just immerse yourself into this world and experience the culture and life over there and be able to just go see what you see and try to create around that. I mean, it's a project that at the time, you know, you're giving up a lot of income because you're committing a month to this and you're basically doing it for free. But you have to believe, I think, in the power of some of these projects and where they can take you. And that's a theme that I've had many times in my career, where you just maybe not get paid for something up front to any substantial degree, but just belief in that thing that you're doing, that it will propel you forward in some way, shape, or form. And so that particular project in the years to come paid dividends many times over, right? I ended up writing a big cover article feature for an adventure magazine when I came back from that. I ended up having an exhibition of the prints from that. To this day, I still sell some of the prints and stock images from that particular project. And so that one, yeah, absolutely memorable, incredible. One of the favorite things that I've ever done in my career. Some other images that have just, I'll share this story because I think it's a good example for people to just go shoot for themselves. I always preach to people about you've got to make the time to just go do creative things, even if they might seem silly or you don't know what's going to happen. You just want to create for the sake of creating. Well, I created an image about 2 years ago that I kind of had in my head for a while. My daughter, Lily, she's one of my favorite little subjects.
There you go.
Yeah, just a wonderful little subject, and I love just hanging out with her. So about 2 years ago, I had asked her one evening, I'm like, do you want to go let me take some pictures of you? And it was right in the middle of lupin season and just really beautiful. And we had kind of gone and I'd taken a photograph of her surrounded by lupins. And then it was still a beautiful night and the sun was starting to get lower in the sky. So we decided to drive a little bit further from where I live here to a place called the Cape Tryon Lighthouse. It was maybe 15 minutes from my house. And so we went out there and there's this beautiful field kind of leading up to this lighthouse and just taking images of her and experiencing this beautiful night and evening with my daughter. And I ended up sharing one of the pictures from that evening. And I just shared alongside the image just some of my thoughts about how magical that experience was. It wasn't even the image. It was just more being out with my family member and this person I love, experiencing this beautiful early summer evening. And that post, like just putting that out there, which I didn't put it out there to get anything in return, but that caught a lot of attention, I guess. It resonated with people. And eventually I got contacted by Prince Edward Island Tourism, who said that post really resonated with them in terms of just trying to encapsulate the spirit of what Prince Edward Island is about. And out of that, them contacting me for that, they then later had an opportunity. They were doing it in partnership with National Geographic, where they wanted to showcase Prince Edward Island through a joint collaboration. And they asked me to participate in that based on that one post I shared of my daughter. So it's just like, it's a very interesting thing I always find over this 20, 25 years in photography, how one thing that you do, if you put yourself into it, can lead to something else. And I really feel like my whole career has been this succession of one experience or moment or thing that you put effort into, even if there's not like a financial reward or you're just doing it because you love doing it.
Right.
But if you put your heart into it, it then leads to something else, which can then lead to something else. And yeah, I just find that whole process fascinating. So
Right.
I know that went off script a little bit, I think, Trevor, to what you were asking
I think
me.
it's fantastic. It just shows the diversity between going and shooting a specific project and actually like shooting an assignment, which is totally different than shooting something for yourself. So that's then another whole skill, which then it becomes memorable because it builds on the last thing and builds on the next thing. So yeah, those are great responses. And yeah, just really spells out exactly what it takes. It's because, like you say, we go back to this social media thing. People see the social media posts and you're here and you're there. And actual life isn't really translated correctly into social media. It's just and this is, again, a photograph. It captures an instant in time of something that's going on in your life. Your whole life isn't like that, right?
No, exactly. It's funny. I think if you actually shared up an accurate picture on social media of what 90% of what you actually do as a photographer, it would be simply this: sitting at a laptop,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, that's the work.
Right.
You're learning that laptop, you're responding to the emails, you're figuring stuff out. There's so much more that goes into each photograph, right? Like yes. I have maybe 100 photographs in a folder that are, say, the 100 images across my 2.3 million images that I've taken in my career that I consider some of the best. And it'd be easy for just someone who stumbled upon them to look at these 100 images and be like, oh, there's some good, interesting work in there. You had a pretty interesting life, or like how great it would be to go to all those places. But Yeah, those 100 images, there's a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and toil, and mosquito bites, and
Yeah.
sore backs, and sore carpal tunnel in your hand from
Right.
typing so many emails. And yeah, there's a lot that have gone into that.
So on the other side of the coin, is there any current projects that you're working on that's maybe coming up that you want people to know about?
Yeah, I've always got a kind of a hodgepodge of things going on. In some years, I have a giant creative project that I'm working on. Others years, it's kind of just little things that I'm doing to kind of just move myself forward creatively and from a career perspective and everything else. And the big thing I'm working on right now these days is just I have a new black and white course,
Okay.
monochrome course that I've kind of been throwing myself into. So a lot of just thought and recording around that. And so that's taken up a lot of time. But I think the biggest thing from a creative perspective for me in the last 6 months, anyways, is I am really fascinated by the idea of learning more about street photography.
Okay.
It's kind of just more moments of life, I guess, would be
Okay.
the best way to describe it. And so I have always shot Canon in my career, for example, and I have a Canon R5, which is a fantastic camera. But about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I decided to buy a second little camera system just for the purpose of street photography. I wanted something a little smaller and off the hip. And so I got a little Fuji XT5 camera. And so the only reason I mention that is it ties into, I guess, what am I doing creatively these days is I'm just trying to kind of, aside from all my professional work, just get out there with the camera more and just be snapping little things and moments without needing a ton of gear and filters and tripods and all this kind of stuff. And I find that you never have enough time for all those things that you want to do. And I wish I had more time for that street photography stuff, but I've done quite a bit of it in the last year and I'm proud of that. And yeah, just really kind of pursuing that. And then aside from that, I'm trying to think project wise. Well, I constantly, and this has been a 20-year project, but usually on average, and of course some months I deviate from this, but on average over the last 20 years, I've probably photographed 2 portrait sessions a month.
Okay.
And it's usually people that I just find interesting or that I come across. And so I've still done quite a few of those in the last year, despite being busy.
Okay.
It's one of those things that, aside from nature photography, gives me a lot of joy in photography. Just being able to meet people and make those connections and experience, trying to figure out the puzzle of them within a hour together.
Right.
And so I have a number of those kind of lined up in the months to come. Again, people that I find interesting, that I'll reach out to them and try to set something up. So, so I guess long story short, I don't have any big dramatic projects, anything that I consider overly dramatic right now, but just a bunch of little things that I'm enjoying.
But it's like they say in Newfoundland, what do you know you wouldn't know? Like from some of your work that you've currently done or are doing, it could spark something else. So it'd be interesting to see how things go. Yeah, it's awesome. Let's just sort of switch a little bit into what do you feel makes an image stand out from the average?
I've thought a lot about that in the last 20 years. And I mean, I used to think it was, I don't know, just a degree of maybe technical perfection or having perfect lighting. I think really, upon looking at millions, if not billions of images in my career, I think what makes a great image great is the fact that you remember it. Right? There's just so many, it's hard to come up with a unique image. It's hard to come up with something that hasn't been done a million times. It isn't a cliche. That isn't just a repeated theme. And I mean, everything's been shot in photography a million times, but there's still magic within some of the representations of those repeated subjects.
Right.
And so anytime I come across an image that somebody else has photographed that makes me pause, I consider that a successful image, because there's so many images that we just scroll by, or that like, okay, that's nice, that's nice, that's nice. there's very few that make us pause or think like, wow, I've never seen that before. And so whenever I come across those images, they excite me. They really do.
Right.
And that goes for my own images too. It's a tough thing to excite yourself when photographing, right? Because we all just go out there and we're feeling things out, and you might take a shot, or you might see something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you think it's a great image. Every once in a while, though, you stumble upon something, or you see something, or you've managed to put the pieces together in a way where you're like, I feel like this is unique, or I feel like this is a new representation, or this is new for myself. And I think those are always the images that make me happiest, or that I consider, quote unquote, the greatest.
Right.
Or just those ones that make you pause.
Awesome. This is the part of the podcast where we showcase some of Dave's images. For those of you following along, go to youcanlearnphotography.ca, click on podcasts, and go to episode 20 for Dave Brosha. Then scroll down to the bottom of that blog post. You'll see a gallery of images. Click on the first image of the Indigenous character portrait, and then you'll be able to follow along as we discuss his images. All right, so I'm just going to do a screen share here. Let's go take a look at a couple of the photos that we're going to talk about today that you've shared with us. And we'll start with this Indigenous portrait.
Yeah, Dougie Rain. So, yeah, that's a gentleman named Dougie Rain, who is an Indigenous powwow dancer based in southern Alberta. And he's kind of a legend in the powwow circuit in Western Canada. He's been dancing for years and years and years. And he was one of the first, just relaying this information or paraphrasing, I hope I don't mess it up. He was one of the very first Indigenous dancers to kind of stray away from a strictly more traditional regalia in terms of what he's wearing, and to venture kind of more into modern themes. And so you see he's wearing this top hat. And from what I've heard is when he very first started wearing that, there was some pushback within the Indigenous powwow circuit just because it strayed, I guess, from the traditional roots.
Right.
But Dougie's literally a guy who marches to the beat of his own drum, and I just find him fascinating and such a kind man. And that was actually photographed on the day I met him.
Okay.
He had agreed to be a subject in Wayne Simpson and my character workshop that we held in Drumheller, Alberta.
Right.
And so sometimes after a long day teaching, Wayne and I want to go photograph ourselves just to kind of get some of that creative energy out. And so this was a shoot that we had arranged that night after our day of teaching was done.
Okay.
And Wayne and I like to challenge each other. And we do this all the time. And sometimes we'll be like, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to put a time limit. And so Wayne, you have 10 minutes with this subject, and I'm going to be your assistant. And then we're going to flip it. And you're going to be my assistant, and I'm going to photograph for 10 minutes.
Right.
And so this particular evening, we went out to this location, and it was just wild wind. It was crazy.
Right.
We could barely hold our light and softbox in place. And I remember Wayne and Wayne's a large man. He's very tall, and he's got this big wingspan of an arm length. And he's got his arms wrapped around this softbox, just trying to hold it in place,
Right.
and it's whipping in the wind. And you can see in this particular image that there's some movement in his feathers. And
Right.
I was very proud of that. I did this deliberately because I'd shot a number of images of him first where just everything's frozen in time, but I felt like it didn't really represent this kind of environment that we were in. So I wanted to kind of really slow down my shutter and try something different. And so I think I shot this around 1/20th of a shutter speed.
Okay.
Something that you wouldn't normally do in the world of portraiture.
Right.
Right. But just trying to hold my camera really steady. And the flash was able to freeze him somewhat. And I don't know, I really liked the vibe of it. I felt like it different and unique to me, and just but showed off his strength. And it's a picture I like, but it's a lot of the pictures that I like the most is not because of the image itself. It's because it brings me back to the experience of photographing and being with these people that evening.
Yeah. You can see the feathers, the movement in the feathers here depicting that there is some wind movement there. Did you ask him the reason for the top hat?
I am sure that I asked him, and I'm sure that he gave me a response. I would be hesitant to paraphrase just because I know there was some reason. I think he just wanted to do something different, and kudos to him.
Right. It's very interesting that he chose that top hat.
Oh, I agree. It's fascinating.
And here's our next image of Hopewell Rocks in New Brunswick.
I was proud of that because that night started off terrible. I had no intention of going to Hopewell Rocks that night, none whatsoever. I was staying in Moncton with my family, and I remember there was all of us, 5 of us, in this hotel room, 2 double beds, and it was just noisy and creaky, and I just couldn't sleep. I was hot, I was cold, and I think after laying awake for about 2 hours or 3 hours, I got up at 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning, and sometimes I get these weird things in my head. I'm like, I'm going to go for a drive. I'm just going to throw my hands up. I know I'm not going to sleep here, so let's just go for a drive. And so I quietly got dressed and gathered my gear and snuck out of the hotel room and started driving. And I ended up in Hopewell Rocks, which I believe is about 25, 30 minutes away from Moncton.
That's about right.
And then I get there and I'm like, I don't even know if I can get down to the shoreline. I don't know if the tide is high or low. This was off season too. And I remember walking to one of the paths down and realized that the stairs were pulled up. It was off season. And so you couldn't even get down to the beach that way. And so I was a little bit disappointed. I'm like, oh gosh, I drove out here for nothing. Then I went down to a different parking lot, different entrance, and I managed to get down on the beach and just walked down towards the rocks, realized it was nice low tide, and then I just kind of came across this site where the moon was right in the middle of the rocks from this angle.
Right.
And I set up my tripod, and well, first of all, I took a picture of just the rocks and the moon and everything, and I thought it was very interesting. And originally I was hoping to shoot the Milky Way there, but realized it was too bright, too much moonlight. Milky Way was in the wrong position in the sky.
Right.
It was very faint. So I decided to just embrace the moon. And so I photographed this first of all, and then I just thought it needed something for a little bit of scale. And so I decided to set up my intervalometer and just kind of walked out into the scene, came back a couple times to adjust where I was going to stand and just kind of suss it out. So I ended up taking this image, and I didn't really think about it at the time. I thought I had an interesting image, but when I got back to the car, and I remember sitting in the parking lot at 4:30 in the morning, and I had my laptop with me, and I decided to transfer it onto my laptop right then and there in the car. And I looked at it, and I was like, wow, that actually kind of looks like somebody's head, the one rock on the left, looking up to the moon, and it kind of looks like a crown of sorts that he's wearing on their head. And then even the other rock, it almost looks like a finger pointing up to the sky as well. So it almost looks like this humanoid figure coming out of the sand, interacting with the heavens. And I just thought it was one of my most interesting astro photos that I had taken to that point. I just thought it was different and unique, and I think I called it Apparitions. Again, it's a reminder to me of a really beautiful night, and it's one of the very few prints that I have. I mean, of all the images I've photographed, I hang very little of my own work in my own house, but I do have that one hanging in my office.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. The decision to decide on whether to allow the moon to be blown out or whether to do a multiple exposure and bring out the detail in the moon, and then actually have the starburst from the moon. So I think in this instance, it's like looking at a star as opposed to looking at the moon. It's interesting from that perspective, like this human head here looking at a star as opposed to looking at the moon. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. And I remember doing a more underexposed version of that, where you could see it more as the moon.
Right.
On a wide angle shot, the moon was so tiny that you couldn't really get the context of it as the moon anyway. So I decided to just embrace it, as you say, kind of making it feel more like this halo of light.
Yeah, with it overexposed, it actually does show up bigger. So it tells more of the story. Interesting.
Thank you.
And you stood down here at the reflection as opposed to like right here in this little bit of light right there.
Yeah, I wanted to frame myself in that bit of, as you say, the reflection in the water.
So you'd show up, right?
Yeah, and I remember I did have to walk back several times and see my position in relation to the actual image being photographed to kind of get it right.
Neat.
Yeah, beautiful night. Just beautiful night.
Do you want to make people aware that aren't familiar with this area to make sure that they check the tides so that you don't get stuck down there when the tide is coming in, because it comes in very quickly. So
just some of the highest tides in the world, and it can be dangerous. So
be safe.
100%.
So here's the next image. Some pretty amazing polar bears.
That was photographed in northern Labrador, in a place called the Torngat Mountains. And a lot of people don't realize that Newfoundland and Labrador have a polar bear population, but the Torngats are actually one of the better places, I think, on the planet for polar bears. And not only, photographing a polar bear anytime is a magical experience, but Torngats are unique in the sense that there's not many places on the planet where you have polar bears in a mountainous environment. So very often most of the pictures that we tend to see of polar bears are photographed in like Churchill, Manitoba, which is incredible, the body of work that comes out of there, but it's very flat and along the edges of the ocean.
Right.
Or where I used to live in Resolute Bay, Nunavut, very flat kind of tundra type area. But yeah, the Torngats are these incredibly dramatic mountain range, and the polar bears actually like climbing up these mountains.
Wow.
And you'll see them kind of way, way up high. And so this was photographed from a boat, which is the safest way to photograph them. You kind of just do these little boat tours,
right,
going out to try to find or spot. And this area of Labrador is fascinating because, and I might have this a little bit wrong, but it's one of the few places, I think maybe the only place, where you have this convergence of polar bears, grizzly bears, and black bears. And you'll find all three in the area. And so, yeah, just for the bear lovers out there, it's just such a dramatic, beautiful place. But so this particular day, we were out on a boat, kind of just cruising along the shorelines of some of this mountainous, cliffy territory, when we saw these two beauties on top of a cliff. And very often in wildlife photography, your time with any given animal might be very brief, because you see them or they spot you and then they take off. But these two, they just posed. I remember them. We were kind of bobbing in this boat and they just stood atop these cliffs for, I can't remember exactly how long, but I want to say it was 5 minutes. So yeah, this was photographed 600 millimeter lens. And I remember taking probably about 500 photographs of these two. And whenever I'm photographing wildlife, you try to get your safety shot. That is just a picture of the wildlife that's well exposed and sharp and all that. But then once you know you have that, you really try to look for a moment or something that showcases personality or that's a little bit unique. And I remember just waiting, and my arms are cramping up and they're getting so sore, and I'm just shooting and just waiting for something really unique and interesting. And then all of a sudden, and it only lasted a split second, their heads kind of separated into these two different directions, and it looked like they were both singing or calling out into the wild.
Right.
And it was just, I thought it was such a beautiful split-second moment in this grander experience.
Right. It's almost like they caught a scent of something, right?
Yeah, or they heard something.
Yeah.
I can't even remember exactly what provoked them. It's an interesting thing when you're watching animals too. They just do things. They're moving to the left, to the right, up, down. They're smelling the air. They're nose down into the tundra bushes, sniffing. Like they're doing all kinds of stuff.
Right.
A lot of it doesn't translate well into photographs.
Right.
But every once in a while, usually if you have enough patience, something great will happen.
Yeah, you wonder what their like those two are relatively clean. You're wondering what their diet is if they're not close to the shore. Of course, you're taking it from a boat, so they must be relatively close to the shore, but their diet is typically seals, right?
Yes, seals is a big part of it. I mean, they're scavengers. They'll eat basically anything that they can get their hands on.
Right.
But that particular time of year tends to be more of a leaner time for them.
Okay.
Because there wasn't so much sea ice at that point. And they very much rely on kind of getting across that sea ice and getting to the edges of the sea ice where seals often will kind of sit up on the ice. So yeah, I'm not sure what exactly they're eating right in that particular time frame, but they look healthy enough.
Oh yeah, they look good. And then on to this next reflection image here.
That one I'm proud of because I think it's an interesting photograph. I called it Frequency North because it looked like sound waves to me. But the reason I'm proud of that image is, I mean, you often hear photographers talk about this, but I think it's so true that you can really create strong images or magic anywhere. That you don't necessarily have to be in a dramatic location. Right. You don't have to travel to Antarctica or the Torngat Mountains or to Egypt. I lived in Northwest Territories for about a decade, and this right here was just kind of literally off the side of the road, the highway that was heading down from Northwest Territories to Alberta. I was driving down to Alberta for some reason, and it was dusk, and I remember not much traffic on that road at all, and I'm driving, and I just saw this nice sunset, and just kind of out of the corner of my eye as I'm driving by at 100 kilometers an hour, I noticed that there's this little swampy, marshy area, and I just caught out of the corner of my eye this interesting reflection. And I remember slamming on the brakes and reversing my vehicle. I think I had a Ford Escape at that time, and reversing down the highway. There's no traffic, and I just stopped on the side of the road, and there was just this beautiful reflection and interesting sky. And I didn't even really clue in at the time that it looked like sound waves. It was just more a beautiful reflection. So I photographed this, but it really kind of resonated with people when I put it out there. A lot of people referred to the fact that it looked like sound waves and just an interesting symmetry. And the funny thing is, I drove by the same location about 2 or 3 weeks later, and it was earlier in the day. And the place where I photographed it looked like this ugly little swamp area. Right. It didn't look like anything that we would say is beautiful or photo worthy. And so, I think that's why I'm proud of this image. It's just a lot of photography is maybe recognizing the potential in something and being able to see beyond the obvious. And
you could push that title a little further by calling it The Sound of Nature.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the times I posted this image up on Facebook, I actually had, and I should try to find this sometime, but I had somebody who was into audio say that they actually tried feeding this into like a sound generator, kind of just to see what it actually came out with.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I believe that image is in your book too, in Northern Light, if I'm not mistaken.
You are correct.
That image, for example, that could be created in PEI or in Nova Scotia or a lot of locations.
All you need is
similar times a day.
All you need is a ditch with water, Trevor.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And the right light.
It's like my wife says, Miss Darlene, she says, shoot your stuff around where you live And she said there's lots of people around the world who haven't seen, our place on Earth, right? So, there's lots of people that haven't seen a mallard duck. So that fits right into this, like, shoot what's around you, right?
Yeah, we all suffer a little bit from that grass is greener on the other side
Yeah.
kind of mentality and thinking. I mean, I've had many conversations with people here on the east coast of Canada where they're like, "Oh, I just wish I could have mountains and have something like Banff or Jasper around here because then I would be a great photographer." And I mean, yeah, bottom line is every environment can be magical with the right eye.
Right.
Yeah.
The right subject, the right light.
Yeah. And just having the perseverance to be out there and look for things.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing those images.
Oh, you're welcome.
These photo books that we mentioned earlier are readily available on Amazon for purchase at a very reasonable rate, and they're beautiful hardcover books with awesome photographs. So I encourage people who want to look for a little bit of inspiration, that are looking for maybe or even a gift to a fellow photographer that they might enjoy. So to get out there and take a look, you'll be very impressed.
Thank you, Trevor.
All right. Yeah. So what tools do you use for post-processing your photos?
I have like a full range and suite of stuff. I mean, Lightroom to Photoshop to different pieces of Nik software. But to be quite honest, I do 99% of my post-processing in Lightroom.
Right.
I think over the years, it's evolved to be a really tremendous tool.
Right.
It used to be that you'd have to go into things like Photoshop and elsewhere quite often to achieve certain things, but I'm a minimalist post-processor. I tend to try to work pretty quickly and efficiently because I don't love spending a lot of time on the computer.
Right.
And so, yeah, I find that I have kind of developed a workflow in Lightroom that works very well for me. Yeah, it tends to be my home with little side trips into Photoshop if I have to clean up a tiny detail or something like that.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. Bottom line is, the better you shoot it in camera, the easier it is to process.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, not always perfect in the field by any means, but definitely try.
Right. You mentioned that you've been mostly a Canon shooter, but typically what cameras and lenses do you shoot with, and why? And is there a specific piece of gear that you take with you when you go out on a shoot that you must have?
Well, since day one, almost ever since that Fuji kind of 2 megapixel camera, the first real quote unquote camera that I ever bought was a Canon Elan 70 film camera. And I kind of graduated from there to the Canon Digital Rebels and then right up to kind of their better DSLRs. So it's progressed. So I've been a Canon shooter for about 20 years, and I still shoot with a Canon R5, which is a tremendous mirrorless camera. I really love it. And if I can just give a quick plug, I've been sponsored by Sigma for, I want to say, the better part of 8 or 9 years now. And so all my lenses, all my glass is Sigma glass.
Okay.
Which I really, really love. And I just find they're tremendous. And so that kind of tends to be my combo that I am out in the field with, is the Canon R5 with any number of Sigma lenses. And I have different favorites or must-have pieces of gear for different genres that I shoot. In the portrait realm, I almost always have a 40 millimeter Sigma art lens with me, along with an 85 millimeter. Those tend to be the two perspectives I love the most.
Okay.
In the landscape realm, I almost always have my 14 to 24 millimeter lens along with my 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Okay. And then wildlife, I have this big beast of a lens, a 600 millimeter lens, which kind of tends to be my go-to for that. But aside from lenses and camera, piece of gear that I always have, to be quite honest, I'm just not much of a gear person. And so I don't lock on specific pieces of gear other than just whatever tool I need for the vision that I have in mind.
It could basically even bear down to a specific type of clothing that you need to wear, or like a specific kind of hiking shoes that you use, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of camera equipment.
Well, I'll take an opposite route to that, Trevor. I think one of my biggest things that I've love when it comes to gear, and one thing that I've learned over the 20 years is the whole thought around less is more, being your friend, in the sense that I feel like I've become a better photographer by leaving more gear at home.
Okay.
It used to be that I would go out and bring 6 lenses with me and the tripod and all the filters. And yes, you'd have all these different tools, but I found that actually worked against me creating better images because A, I'd be so bloody tired lugging this stuff around that I wouldn't have the creative energy to shoot stuff. And B, you never really got into seeing truly through one piece of equipment, because you'd take a picture with one lens and then be like, okay, now I think I want to try the next one. And you kind of cycle between them rather than honing a vision. And so I feel like the gear now, I really think about what gear I'm going to need before I go and shoot anything. And I try to be as minimalistic with it as possible and really pick the right piece of gear for the particular creative project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so a little more planning makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, and that comes down to even what camera bag I'm going to bring. I have 3 or 4 different camera bags, and I really, am I going to be hiking, or am I going to be just accessing in my car my lenses? And so it all, every day when I'm out there, it's almost like a different kit, a different collection of gear, but to serve the purpose of the particular theme that I'm shooting.
Right.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Always not be tired, be comfortable, and so you can concentrate on your photography.
Oh yeah, your creative energy is way higher when you are not exhausted from lugging stuff around.
Right. Do you print your own images or do you use a photo lab?
Both. So I have a printer that does up to 17 inches wide.
Okay.
So like a 17 by 22 print, and smaller I do here at home. And I do enjoy that printing process, and because just having that degree of control and just being able to print, make some adjustments, I find fascinating. Bigger stuff, though, I do use a lab for.
Right. So is your home printer that you have, is it a Canon or an Epson?
I use an Epson. Yep.
Okay.
I had Canon for years, but about 3 or 4 years ago, switched to an Epson printer, and I love it.
Okay. And how often do you print?
I go in stages. So, I mean, there's always kind of customer or client orders, people ordering prints. So, and of course, pre-Christmas and stuff like that world's busier, so you're printing a lot more. But aside from client stuff, just for myself, I mean, I'll go through some periods where I'm printing all the time, and just I have I like printing just even pictures of my family, and or just some of my favorite images that I've photographed. I'll print and just put in kind of an archival box just to have.
Yeah, the thing I was really getting to there was, with inkjet printers, you normally have to print every so often in order to keep the heads from clogging up, and also consideration into the cleaning process that they have to go through or they want to go through, depending upon how often you print, which can either use more ink or less ink. So that was the reason for the question. Yeah,
and it's funny for anyone. I'm glad you asked that. Anyone interested in getting into printing, just know that it's not something where you're going to want to invest some money in a nice printer and all the ink and then print twice a year, because it'll just be an exercise in frustration as those print heads clog and you're constantly trying to keep things running smoothly. But if you're printing frequently, they work fantastic, and it can be quite rewarding.
Yeah, some printers, and specifically why I asked Canon or Epson, because is that some printers you can replace the print heads and some you can't. So that's a consideration that you need to think about. And again, take good care of your printer to know that you're not going to clog up the print heads by not using it, right?
Exactly.
Are there any tips for listeners that you'd like to share on business in general, including advice about how to connect with clients before, during, and after working with them? Such as maybe even things like how important contracts are. So just some general tips that you find have served you well over the years.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things that I can offer from a business perspective is just, I find the people that do the best from a business perspective in photography are those that aren't afraid to put themselves out there and be strong marketers and just not being afraid of the word no. I think a lot of people have the mistaken belief that if you create nice images and maybe just put them on a website, that people will start coming to you and ordering prints or hiring you to be their photographer. And I mean, that does happen, but really, I find most of the business wins, I think, in my career have just been by being brave enough to approach things, approach a business that you want to work with, or approach a magazine that you want to get published in, and not wait for the world to come to you, for you to kind of
Right.
go to them. But with that comes rejection, comes people saying no,
Right.
comes people not answering you, and you have to be prepared for that. But I think, yeah, just being consistent and trying to be kind too. And I know that's a hard thing to define, but just trying to care, right? Trying to care about your
Right.
customers and clients. And you asked the question about contracts. And the interesting thing is, I mean, in my career, I've photographed literally thousands of clients, and only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of those have I ever done a contract with. And it's usually just on the biggest projects.
Right.
For example, doing a wedding for somebody or doing a 5-day commercial shoot for a government organization. Those are kind of the things that I do contracts with. I feel like the business, I guess, slogan or mantra that I've tried to stick to for 20 years that has served me well, not always, but served me really well, is just, I think if you're good to people, they'll be good to you. I mean,
Right.
that's really just the contract maybe that I've tried to place on myself. And I'm not perfect, and I've made mistakes along that route, but I think for the most part that has served me really well in business, is just trying to be good to people and not be too rigid and not to have business come in front of personal relationships most
Right.
of the time, right? So yeah, it's a hard thing to define, but I think bottom line in business, and actually, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the American photographer Joel Grimes.
Yep.
He's a fantastic teacher, educator, portrait photographer. I heard a talk that he gave many, many years ago, and it always stuck with me. And I'll give him credit for this. But he basically said, when it comes to the business of photography, he said, hard work will beat talent 9 times out of 10. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to mess up that quote a bit. But that stuck with me. But it's so true. The ones who tend to be successful in the world of photography aren't necessarily the greatest photographers. Sometimes that
Right.
happens. You have a really great photographer who also does great from the business perspective. But
Right.
if you can make the prettiest pictures on the planet and the most impactful, but if you don't know how to put yourself out there, or you're not afraid to put yourself out there, you may never realize business success. So I
Right.
think that's a very important lesson. It's just to work hard and to have perseverance and to not give up when one thing doesn't work out and go on to another thing. I've had many business failings in my life. I've had many projects that haven't quite hit their mark. I've had things that I've launched that have gone terrible, but I think I have perseverance.
Right.
And I think it's a very important trait to have in this.
Right. So key is learn from your mistakes.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you fall down, pick yourself back up. Right.
Oh, absolutely. And just not get too discouraged and just
Right.
realize that the next thing you do might be a success.
Yeah, exactly. What's the one thing you wish you would have known before you started your photography journey?
That's a great question, Trevor. One thing that I wish I'd known. I wish that 20 years ago, I even believed stronger that I could do this. And because I think you go through so many years of self-doubt and wondering if you're wasting time at something that might not work out. Yeah, so you spin a lot around that. You just, I think, waste some time in that process. If I had more self-confidence 20 years ago to realize that I could do this and that I could be successful at this, I feel like maybe I would have done it sooner. Maybe I would have had, but then again, on the flip side, I think everything sort of happens for a reason in your journey too, right? If things had happened too easy, maybe you wouldn't be who you are today. So,
right.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think just just believing in yourself to stick it out and to, if you want something strong enough to go after it, is a lesson that I wish that it was stronger in my brain in those early days.
Right. Where do you see yourself in the next 3 to 5 years?
I'm laughing because I mentor a lot of people in photography, and I teach a lot of people. And that's usually the first question that I ask them. People make fun of me for saying it. So it's good to see the tables turned. To be quite honest, Trevor, if I had a goal in 5 years, it'd be to be doing the same thing that I'm doing now.
Right.
Because I really do love what I do, and I feel like I have a lot of tremendous opportunity, and I have a lot of experiences that I love, and I haven't had to work a quote unquote normal office job since 2008, and I hope I don't ever have to. So if I can see myself in 5 years, it would just be doing more of the same and just hopefully keeping that creative spark alive and doing stuff that I find interesting and trying to maintain a business around that so that I can keep doing it.
Living what you love to do.
Fingers crossed.
Awesome. What's the one piece of advice you'd like to share with a beginner to photography? And if anyone that's already a photographer but thinking they want to start it as a professional career or starting a photography business?
Well, here's a piece of advice that I think could apply to both. And I think it was a huge realization for me, and is this whole notion of social media can be one of the greatest benefits or greatest poisons, I think, to us as photographers. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of newer photographers come into photography, but a lot of experienced photographers too fall victim to this, is feeling like the response you get on social media somehow dictates the worth of your images.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bad trap. It's a really bad trap. And I see a lot of younger or newer photographers kind of fall into that trap where they start shooting around the response they get. So instead of shooting what's in their heart or that thing that drew them into photography or that thing that they love seeing in the world, from a subject standpoint, they'll see what gets a big response and gets those likes in Facebook and Instagram, and then just start shooting very narrow that. But that doesn't necessarily mean the best art or the best images. Yeah, the most impactful images. And I think anytime a photographer comes along and can learn how to embrace social media from a marketing perspective and to get your work out there, but not let it dictate your voice or vision, I think those are the ones that really shine to me. Those are the photographers that I think can really carve out their own path and maybe become more well-known in their field ultimately because they're shooting something truer. And so, and that the same applies to kind of more of a more experienced photographer as well. If you just kind of keep bouncing around shooting the next big thing that gets a like on Facebook, you're never really going to be, I think, honing your own vision or honing that thing that makes you you. And so I think the quicker that we can learn to push aside that obsession with social media response, the more quickly that we can push forward, I think, just everything else, our art, our business, I'm speaking from experience. I feel like for the first 10 years of my career, I very much cared about that. And I very much maybe shot to what I thought was going to get a good social media reaction.
Right.
But I would say my career has done better things in the last 10 years by not caring as much about that.
Right. I sort of mentioned sometimes some people ask me a similar question. I'll say, don't be afraid to take advice, but at the same time, don't let anyone ruin your love for photography.
Absolutely. There's a difference between helpful critique and just unwarranted online trolling and criticism, whatever. I think critique is a wonderful thing, right? When you seek out a critique from somebody you respect.
Right.
But there's a lot of people on the internet that just love to criticize for unsolicited. And I don't think that's helpful to anyone.
No.
And it can destroy a lot of people's love of doing photography, as mentioned, right? Just because they might get dejected from the wrong comment from the wrong person that they didn't even ask for.
Exactly. So let's take a look here where you can be found on the internet. And again, you have a fairly large following already, but anyone who doesn't know about you and wants to know, where can they find you? Here we have, associated with the podcast, there's a blog post, and on that blog post, we can see that you have a website presence, you have Facebook, Instagram, and you're also on Twitter, and now actually called X. So maybe just talk about each one of these and what someone will find if they connect with you on those specific locations on the internet.
Absolutely, Trevor, and thanks for sharing those up. My website is perhaps my biggest artistic home. It's got stuff from across genres. It's got my portfolio, information on workshops and the books and stuff like that. And as with everyone's website, always, I feel like it's outdated and I need to give it some TLC and add new images, and that's always a work in process. But it is perhaps my favorite artistic home online. So on Facebook, I've got a couple different, places where I live on Facebook. I've got my main quote unquote page. I think it's Dave Brosha Photography. I tend to share a lot of my nature and landscape world there. But if any of you are photographers and interested, I have an education group on Facebook called Dave Brosha Education, which I encourage you to request to join. And it's a great little community of photographers and just really helpful, supportive people. So feel free to request to join there. On Instagram, I've got a few different accounts. I've got my main one, which is just my name, Dave Brosha, which is a portrait-heavy presence. And then I have one called Dave Brosha Places, which is kind of more of my landscape nature work. I'm on X, Twitter. I share some images there, but I'm just more there to read news and stay informed about the world's happenings. But I do love it there too.
All right, awesome. I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join up and be a guest on the podcast. And we really appreciate you being here today.
Trevor, thank you so very much for, just everything that you do and putting these podcasts out to the world and just giving people the opportunity to listen to different viewpoints from the world of photography. It's much appreciated.
Thank you for dropping by and listening to the You Can Learn Photography podcast. If you're interested in being on the show, please contact us by visiting the contact page on youcanlearnphotography.ca. We hope this show provides some inspiration and allows you to get to know some of the fellow photographers in Canada. So until next time, enjoy your photography and keep shooting.